My uncle left me the cabin when he passed, along with a strange note taped to the inside of the front door. Leave the radio on, always, no matter the season. I found it odd, but I figured it was just one of his quirks. He'd always been the eccentric one in the family. The cabin sat deep in the woods of northern Michigan, 3 miles from the nearest paved road, the kind of isolation that had made my uncle happy for the better part of 30 years. I decided to spend a week there that October, mostly to clear my head after a rough year, and partly out of curiosity about the place I'd inherited but never really visited. The radio was an old analog model sitting on a shelf near the fireplace, the kind with a dial you turned by hand instead of digital buttons. It was already on when I arrived, tuned to a station playing quiet, static-laced music, the kind of low-fidelity broadcast you'd expect from a small local station out in the middle of nowhere. I almost turned it off out of habit. Something made me hesitate, remembering the note, and I left it running in the background. The first 2 days were peaceful. I read, I walked the trails around the property. I enjoyed the kind of silence that only exists far away from any city. The radio played softly in the background the entire time, occasionally drifting between stations, occasionally settling into stretches of static before finding music again. It was on the 3rd night that the radio said my name. I was reading by the fireplace when the music cut out, replaced by a moment of dead air, followed by a calm, measured voice that said my full name clearly, twice, before the static returned and the music picked back up as if nothing had happened. I told myself it was a coincidence, some strange overlap with another broadcast, a trick of my exhausted mind after a long day of hiking. I almost convinced myself of that. The next night, it happened again. This time, the voice didn't just say my name. It said the exact time, down to the minute. And then it said, quite clearly, "Don't go to the lake tonight." I hadn't planned on going to the lake. There was a small lake about half a mile from the cabin, one my uncle used to mention fondly in old letters, always describing it as peaceful, a good place to think. I'd considered walking down there the next morning, but I certainly hadn't mentioned that plan to anyone, and there was no possible way a radio broadcast could have known. I didn't sleep much that night. The following morning, curiosity got the better of caution. I decided to walk to the lake anyway, partly to prove to myself that the warning meant nothing, that I was simply exhausted and imagining patterns where none existed. The trail to the lake was overgrown, but walkable. When I arrived, the water was still and gray under an overcast sky, unremarkable in every way, except for one detail. Along the muddy shoreline, half submerged, was an old wooden rowboat, clearly abandoned for years, with a name faintly painted on its side that had mostly worn away with time and weather. I could still make out enough letters to recognize my uncle's first name. I went back to the cabin unsettled, though nothing outwardly dangerous had happened. I told myself the boat had simply belonged to my uncle, left behind after his passing. Nothing more sinister than that. That night, the radio spoke again. This time it didn't say my name. It described, in careful detail, exactly what I had done that day. The walk to the lake, the boat, even the specific moment I'd stood at the shoreline looking at the faded lettering. Then it said calmly, "You shouldn't have gone." I unplugged the radio that night for the first time since arriving. The silence that followed felt heavier than any silence I'd experienced in the woods before. I told myself I was being irrational, that unplugging a radio wouldn't undo whatever strange coincidence or technical anomaly had been happening. I went to bed anyway, feeling for the first time since arriving that I wanted to leave the cabin entirely and never come back. I woke sometime after 3 in the morning to the sound of music playing softly downstairs. The radio, which I had personally unplugged from the wall before bed, was on again, playing the same quiet, static-laced music from my first night at the cabin. I went downstairs slowly, more out of a need to confirm what I already suspected than out of any real hope of a rational explanation. The radio was plugged in. The cord ran neatly to the outlet exactly as it had every other night. As though I had never touched it at all, I sat with the radio for the rest of that night, unwilling to unplug it again, unwilling to test whatever pattern I had apparently stumbled into. Sometime near dawn, the voice returned one final time, calm as always, and said something I still think about constantly. He used to sit right where you're sitting. He listened every night for 30 years. That's why he left the note. Some things need a listener, or they find one. I left the cabin that same morning and never went back. I called a local realtor within the week and listed the property for sale, describing it honestly as a peaceful, isolated retreat, mentioning nothing about the radio, which I left exactly where I'd found it, plugged into the wall, playing softly to an empty room. I don't know who eventually bought the cabin. I never followed up, never asked, never wanted to know. I do know that if you ever inherit a strange old cabin from a relative who left behind an unusual note about a radio, I would think very carefully before deciding you know better than they did. Some instructions exist for reasons we're better off never fully understanding.